In Excel, we often find ourselves doing very manual and repetitive tasks. At that point, you may wish to decide to create a macro. A macro is a perfect solution to automating a repetitive and manual task. If you're serious about working with macros in Excel, there are really three things that you need to address. The first one is to ensure that you have the Developers tab showing on your ribbon. As you can see here in this particular file, I don't have a tab called Developers in my ribbon. So I'm going to click on File and I'm going to click on Options, and what we have here on the left hand side is the ability to customize the ribbon. When I customize the ribbon on the right hand side, I can see a number of tabs can be ticked or unticked, and I notice that the Developer tab is unticked. So I'm going to tick this option here and I'll click OK. What I now find when I look up in my ribbon is to the right of the View tab, I have a Developers tab. When you look at the Developers tab, you can tell by the use of these command buttons that it specializes in the area of code, add-ins and controls, and even XML. So that's the first thing we need to do, and that should now stay on. You shouldn't have to do that again. Once you've got the Developers tab up, you then need to check your macro security is conducive to working with macros. On the Developers tab in the Code group, there's a Macro Security button. If you click that button, you'll encounter this window here, or dialog box. There are basically four options, and the first three disable macros to varying levels. The first one, for example, will disable all macros without notification. So if you create macros or receive macros, they simply won't work, and you won't know why because you haven't received notification. What I'd like you to do is to enable all macros, which means that any macros you create or receive, you'll easily be able to run and to work with. I know it does say that it's potentially dangerous, and that is because there's always that potential that a macro might actually be a virus, but that's why we've got antivirus software. So I'm going to enable all macros and click OK. The third thing we need to be aware of is that a file that is to contain macros or to host macros can't be saved as an XLS file. So typically whenever we save a file, let me just go into File and Save As, and browse, the file type is typically an Excel workbook, which is an XLSX file. But if you're going to store macros in a workbook, you have to save that workbook as a Macro Enabled Workbook, which is in fact an XLSM file. So make sure that you save your file as a Macro Enable Workbook if you're going to save your macros. If you don't, you will be warned that this is a VBA project and you will lose your code. It's almost a good habit to save it as a Macro Enable Workbook before you start creating macros. So I'm just going to dive out of here for now. What I would like to do is I'd like to start by recording a macro. And for this I'm going to ask you to open a file called Budget. So I'm just going to go to File and open the file on my desktop called Budget. Not Budget 2, but Budget. Notice it's also a Macro Enabled Workbook. And I'll click OK, or Open in this case. So I've opened up this particular file called Budget, and I'm going to save as. I like the key F12. F12, the function key, is a quick way to save as. So excuse me if I use the function key. I'm going to save this file as Chapter 1. And I'm going to ensure that it is a Macro Enabled Workbook, and I'll hit Save. And now I've saved the file as Chapter 1. I'd now like to select a certain range of cells, and they are D7 to F8. And what I want to do is I want to record a macro that formats the selected cells into currency in 0 decimal places. I don't want the macro to record selecting the cells, I want the macro to record doing something to the cells that are already selected. So there's a fine point there. But anyway, with these cells selected, I'll go to the Developers tab and I'll click the Record Macro button. Immediately this window appears and it wants to know what do you want to name the macro. So I want to name the macro Format Currency. Now the one thing with macros is you're not allowed spaces in their names, so it's always got to be one word. Some people will put Format _ Currency, but I just usually put one word. It's completely up to you. I'd like to store the macro in this workbook, so it'll only ever run if this workbook's open, and I'll click OK. I simply want to format these to currency in 0 decimal places, and there's a variety of ways, as you're well aware, that you can do that. I might just quickly go right click and I might go Format Cells and I might choose currency and 0 decimal places. That's one way, and I'll click OK. So I've recorded making those cells currency and 0 decimal places, and that's all I really want to record. So I can stop recording now just by going up to my Developers tab and clicking the Stop Recording button. Now the next thing is, once we've recorded the macro, we may want to test that it actually works. So I'm now going to select a different range of cells. For example, I'll highlight D9 to F10. If I then go to the Macros button on my Developers tab, or press Alt F8, you can see it listed there, I'm then able to see any macros that I have, and I only have one macro. I can then choose to run that macro just by clicking the Run button. As soon as I do, you can see these numbers are now currency in 0 decimal places. It's a bit painful to actually go to the Developers tab and hit the Macros button and click the Run button to run a macro. So sometimes what we do is we decide to assign a shortcut key combination to a macro to make it easy to run a macro. Now how you do this is on the Developers tab back in that Macros button, there was actually an Options button. If you click the Options button, you're able to assign a shortcut key to a particular macro. Now you'll notice the word control was mentioned there, and that is because you can't exclude the control key from a shortcut key combination. Control has to be part of that shortcut key. We don't want to use Control A to Z because they're already assigned to default Excel functions. For example, Control A is select all, Control B is bold, Control C is copy, so we don't want to use those sorts of keys. So I recommend that you use Control Shift combinations. So I'm going to press the key combination Shift C. And what I'm basically doing is assigning Control Shift C to the macro format currency. So I'll click OK and I'll click Cancel. If I then select a different range, and it really doesn't matter which range you choose, but I'll just follow the notes and go for D11 to F13. If I now press Control Shift C, it converts those cells to currency in 0 decimal places. Notice also that range was larger than the original range of cells, and that's why I didn't want to record selecting the range of cells. I just wanted this macro to format the cells I had selected, whether that be 1 or 1,000,000 cells, into currency in 0 decimal places.